This is Mark Sobel, U.S. Chair OMFIF. Today, I'm truly delighted and honored to be joined again by Natalie Jaresko, Ukraine's brilliant former finance minister from late 2014 through mid-2016, a period in which Ukraine achieved some of its most significant economic reforms in the country's history. And Natalie also is with the Aspen Institute. Natalie also joined OMFIF last year for a discussion on Ukraine's economy and financing, and it was one of the most widely watched OMFIF videos of 2022. So you're always a welcome guest. So welcome back.
Thank you so much. Thank you for having me.
So as we both know, all eyes are understandably on the military dimensions of Ukraine's brave fight against Russia's barbaric war. But as both of us have emphasized, wars must be paid for, not just the military hardware, but the cost of running a government, such as paying pensions, salaries, etc. And absent means of financing, governments will revert to money printing, which can cause hyperinflation. So as the US knows from its own history, the Continental Congress in 1775 issued paper currency called Continentals to help fund the American Revolutionary War, and lots of them, making them worthless and giving rise to an American term, not worth a continental. Putin would love nothing more than to see a hyperinflationary situation arise in Ukraine. It's imperative that not happen. So when we last spoke, Ukraine's economy was showing signs of stress, and the process of mobilizing non-inflationary finance was beginning to attract attention. Inflation was in the upper 20s, reserves declined, the hryvnia had been devalued. So how's Ukraine's macroeconomy, banking system, and currency holding up? And we'll get to financing in a moment, but what policy steps have the authorities taken to steady the situation, and kind of what's your overall take on the macro situation?
Well, I think what's interesting, Mark, is that a year later, what we can see is that this war really is a war of attrition, and it means that the economy is the most important element. We focus, as you said, on the military, but if we look at what Putin has been doing, what Russia's been doing to Ukraine over the last year, it's been an intentional destruction of the economy, from mining 1/3 of the land so that agricultural exports can't be resumed, to blocking the ports so that no exports can be resumed, to destroying the electrical infrastructure. And all through this, Ukraine's economy has been rather resilient. It hasn't succeeded in destroying the economy. Partly that's because of decent policy work in Ukraine. As the IMF has just agreed, both fiscal and monetary policy have been pretty reasonable given the situation. And partly it's because of the support of the G7 and the broader Western community of democracies. So GDP dropped about 30% in 2022. This year, estimates, although it's early in the year, you don't know how the war is going to proceed, but estimates are just above 1% to just below 1% drop in GDP. Inflation seems to be slowing. It's at about 25%, but it's not skyrocketing, again, because of reasonably good monetary policy and financial support from the G7. I think the number that people get concerned about is debt to GDP, which ended at over 85%. But that's one of those things that, it's academically important and it may be critical when the war is over, but today it's not a target that anyone's really thinking about. So I would say that, in fact, the economy is the core issue right now, and that when we talk about weapons, it's in order to end the destruction of the economy.
And the currency seems to be somewhat holding up, and between inflows, outflows, and capital regulations, there is relative steadiness in the currency.
Exactly. The banking system is resilient. It's functioning. There's no run on the banks. If you compare it to when I was Minister of Finance and this invasion began almost 9 years ago, at that time, the currency was just free flow, dropped to the ground. We had a 65% decline in devaluation. We had 100 banks that had to be closed. But all that work that had been done over the last 8-9 years in terms of strengthening the central bank, its supervisory capabilities, its regulatory capabilities, its monetary policy, its independence, all seems to be paying off today in relatively good both management of the economy and resilience.
Well, I was going to ask you at some point, in the context of macro, maybe now or later, about corruption, the fight about corruption, which has been a huge problem for Ukraine over the decades of its existence. There have been huge international efforts to create robust institutions. Maybe you want to say a word about that?
I think we're making great progress. And I think that, again, the IMF just said that as well in part of this program monitoring with board involvement that they've been doing the last few months. We, in fact, have eliminated much of the currency that supported corruption by eliminating trade with Russia on gas. That was one of the single biggest sources of corruption. There was always a middleman between Russia and Ukraine purchasing gas. And in 2016, when we stopped purchasing it, that cash flow ended. The second part has been establishing institutions, as you said, a new anti-corruption prosecutor, a national anti-corruption bureau, and so on. And those institutions have not only been stood up, but they are functioning. Even during war today, you are seeing arrest after arrest of both assets and individuals. To some extent, we've got to wait and see how this pans out, whether or not it's been politically influenced or not, but there has been more activity in the anti-corruption institutions, I think, over the last 6 months than maybe over the last 6 years. And then the last part is that there's been a great deal of transparency put into this government, and that is everything from declarations of government officials' assets to procurement processes. Now, during the war, some of this has lapsed. Some of these processes that were put in place over the last 8 years, it's going to be critically important to get them started again. I understand that in wartime things are difficult, but the transparency of procurement, the transparency in budgeting, and the transparency of asset declarations all are critical to, in essence, making sure that there's less corruption. The last point I'll make is the path will be much more rapid because we are on an EU membership path. And we are going to be pulled in, just as Poland, Hungary, Czech Republic, and others were pulled in to an EU set of rule of law, EU regulations, and EU responsibilities. And Ukraine is rapidly moving forward with all of those conditions because it is absolutely committed to meeting membership requirements.
Thank you for that. So in our last chat, we both noted it was critical for the US and Europe in particular to provide budget support to Ukraine to help it avoid recourse to inflation finance. We talked about measures Ukraine itself needed to take up to shore up its own finances to the best extent possible, such as domestic resource mobilization bonds, etc. But how is all that going? And at the time, the US was delivering support, but Europe was deliberating. So how much have the US and Europe given, and do they have plans locked in for 2023? And is this process working fairly well at this point?
We've seen a major improvement since we last spoke. Last year, Ukraine received about $32 billion of financial budgetary support, the largest share from the United States, about 13 billion, second largest from the EU, $8.5–9 billion. But it was difficult because it wasn't predictable and it wasn't necessarily timely. And that caused all kinds of problems because this is the money that pays the civil servants. This is the money that makes sure that pensions are paid. This is the money that ensures that the internally displaced people, some 3.6 million people in the country, are receiving that tiny little subsidy to enable their lives. And so the timing was really difficult. In terms of this year, we're seeing that it's much more routine and regularized. The G7's committed $39 billion for this year. For the first 2 months of the year, already Ukraine received $6 billion, and that's about what they need, about $3 billion deficit in the non-military budget per year. So there's a great improvement. Now, the only thing I'm going to say is that all depends on Ukraine continuing to collect taxes at a reasonable rate despite the war. That means right now, last year, they collected about 36% of GDP in taxes. They're going to have to continue with that level of tax collection because otherwise, the costs of recovery, I'm not talking about reconstruction, but each time there's a massive bombing across this country, you have to reestablish electricity, reestablish water. Those recovery costs will drag that deficit to be even larger. And so I think Ukraine has to work very carefully on revenues. It has to be very careful to control that deficit. And the international community seems to be doing well right now in terms of delivering on a predictable and timely basis that $3 billion on average per month support.
And they also need to issue many bonds as possible to tap into finance, be it globally from the diaspora or their own resources. Well, I mean, I was recently delighted to see pictures of Janet Yellen in Kiev, because I think that she strongly underscored the points that you were just making about the need for budget support and steadfast U.S. support. I take it you agree with that?
I do, and I think that the G7 $39 billion commitment is fabulous, but we still need the IMF in there. The $39 billion will not be enough, including recovery costs. And so I think it's really important today. The IMF has begun discussions on a new program with Ukraine after a successful program monitoring with board involvement. This is a term that doesn't come out of the mouth easily.
That's because it didn't exist until Ukraine came along.
And so I'm hopeful that they're going to be thinking out of the box, because it's not going to be enough, and we're going to need to continue that support. Again, this is a war of attrition, and Putin thinks he can destroy Ukrainian resolve through destroying the economy and destroying the unity of the country. So far, he has failed to do either, and we have to ensure that that's the case going forward.
Well, we've already talked a little bit about the economics of it all. I've been very critical of the IMF for being slow to date, but it does seem that within the next month there will be a major program. The IMF, a few days ago, Monday, I think, held a board meeting to temporarily raise access limits. I think this will allow Ukraine to get around $5 billion in the next year from the IMF and have a program of about 15 to 16 billion dollars that hopefully will play a catalytic role. Of course, there are the other MDBs such as the World Bank, etc. So basically, is there anything you want to add about what you think the IMF needs to accomplish? And then do you have any comments on the MDBs more generally?
So on the IMF, I guess I'm hoping that it's going to be a balanced view. I think, it's very hard to think of implementing a reform program in the midst of this kind of war. And so there's going to have to be a balanced view as to what can actually be accomplished. That was something that was important to us 8-9 years ago when the war began. But at that time, 7% of the territory had been occupied. Today, 17% has been occupied. And at that time, the war was regional in the east and the south. And now it's absolutely across all parts of the country. So I'm hoping that the IMF is going to be reasonable in its demands, although I think it's extremely important to have the IMF saying, listen, you can't just eliminate taxes. You need to have a reasonable fiscal policy. So I think if they work together well, this is going to be very positive for Ukraine. And as you said, it should be catalytic. In terms of the World Bank and the MDBs, I just think institutions are going to need to be a little more creative, as they were during COVID. This is not routine. This is not work as normal time. This is a very unique situation that requires unique solutions. And so I think everyone's going to have to look and dig deep for both resources and approaches to how to support Ukraine in a way that's fiscally responsible, transparent, of course, but at the same time, as I said, helps Ukraine to win the war, not only not lose the war, but to win the war.
Great. So the war proceeds, but after the war and even during it, Ukraine's going to face massive reconstruction needs. We knew this when we last chatted, but time has evolved and perhaps there's greater clarity. So, do you have any views about, and here, I'll just throw out a ton of questions. You can answer what you want. We could probably be here for hours, but we won't be. But do you have any sense of the amounts? Do you have any greater clarity or thinking about the role that the private sector should play and how the public sector can catalyze that? And there's always the issues about coordination. Should Russian central bank assets be blocked assets be used? So anyway, one could write a book on any of these topics, but have at it, Natalie.
It is enough for a book or two. I think, there's been an enormous amount of work done on this. Every think tank across the transatlantic region has done work. German Marshall Fund, Brookings, CSIS, CEPR. I mean, everyone is doing this. And I think there's a general agreement that today you can estimate, Kiev School of Economics and the World Bank have looked at over $650 billion of damage. And that damage unfortunately continues to increase. And so anyone can look at an amount between 500 billion and $1 trillion. I think there's overall agreement that it needs to be organized, it needs to be well planned. I don't think everyone's agreed on how to do that. And I think there's a battle between leadership of the EU and the United States as to how to share the mantle of that donor coordination role. Obviously, I am in favor of it being shared, not so the EU is not solely responsible, because I think the United States has an incredibly important role to play, both financially, but also, as you said, because the private sector is going to be important, and the US private sector is going to look to the US government for signaling. When it comes to how to finance $1 trillion of damage, first of all, I think we all need to recognize that's over a long period of time. That doesn't happen in 1 year. This economy could not absorb that kind of money. And I think we look to 3 or 4 sources. One is the frozen Russian assets, and I'll start with frozen government central bank assets, the 300 billion or so in central bank reserves of Russia that have been frozen across the G7. I think that it is time for the politics to match the desire to support Ukraine. The politics needs to move forward and signal that those monies are going to be not only frozen, but used for Ukrainian reconstruction. I think the legal issues have been used as an excuse. I think that several colleagues of yours and mine, Philip Zelikow and others, have done a great deal of research to show that, in fact, the legal hurdles are not great. The legal decisions globally that compensation Ukraine is entitled to compensation have been made. There are UN resolutions that say that. The International Court of Justice decisions that have been made. And the adjudication as to who's at fault, the state of Russia, has also already been put in place by those UN and ICJ decisions. So I think it's time to signal globally, and I mean signal to Ukraine that we are going to put those assets to work, to give them hope, to begin that planning process. How are you going to use those $300 billion of assets? But also to signal Russia that is leverage in what, again, I believe is a war where the economy is critical. And we need to show and signal to Russia that those assets are going to go to strengthening the Ukrainian economy. I think that we have precedent. If you think about the first Gulf War, there were reparations from Iraq to Kuwait. To think about $50 billion transferred hands over time. And I think that we have a very good signal from the EU Council, which I think last week signaled that they are looking to do just this. So I think Russian central bank assets are critical for many, many reasons, and we need to take a step now. I think it takes a much longer time with the due process in all of our countries to take the frozen oligarch assets, that is individual lawsuits. So I don't think that's something we can count on, although I think the process should begin. I think the governmental funds, whether it be bilateral or multilateral, are going to be a big part of this, again, because they set precedent, because they're catalytic. But I think in the end, the private sector is going to be the key. And for the private sector to be key, those government actors have to show real intent now. And because politics changes, we have elections in all our countries. I think it's important to show that that is not something that will change with majorities in a House or Senate, that will not change with a presidential election. And I think those statements need to be made so that the private sector can feel comfortable beginning due diligence and setting themselves out there. I also think that there are going to have to be critical programs put in place by MIGA at the World Bank, by the DFC here in the United States, to provide the kind of military risk insurance that I believe is going to be required by private investors. I think President Zelensky and the Ukrainian government have done a great job in engaging Goldman Sachs, JP Morgan, BlackRock, to start thinking about how institutional investors can be a part of this and what's going to be required so that all the pieces can be put in place soon enough and we don't have to wait years after this war is over. Again, signaling these announcements, making these monies available, even if they can't physically be put into Ukraine today, has many, many valuable purposes, giving hope to the people of Ukraine, enabling real planning and leverage over Russia in a war of attrition.
Well, great. Well, time is passing. Let me just ask a question. I know how you're going to answer it, but you already alluded to it, which is sustaining government support for the war effort and the efforts beyond. One reads in the United States that in some quarters, domestic support for financing Ukraine is flagging. People are getting tired. It's expensive. We have needs at home. What do you say to those people, and how worried are you about that view?
I am concerned. I'm concerned because you're hearing it in the news. You're hearing it in every podcast all the time, and I think it's cementing the concept that this is a real fear. I think, I travel a lot throughout the United States. I think popular support for Ukrainians is extraordinarily high even today. The respect for the courage, the resilience, the absolute strength of the Ukrainian people and their defiance is recognized. And so I think it's important to keep that story there so that the American people will continue to feel that way. It doesn't necessarily translate into votes in Congress, and I think that's where the problem is. And so I think it requires all of us to step back and reassess what is going on. This is not a war between Ukraine and Russia alone. This really is the fate of the world order being decided. And I think the administration has done a good job, both with the transatlantic community and in the United States, but could do a much better job in defining this in a way that the American people understood that this isn't some faraway land and faraway battle, but this is a battle that someone, Ukrainians, is fighting for all Americans. All Americans benefit from the world order being maintained, from rule of law and international law being maintained. It helps us in trading, it helps us in exports, it helps us in maintaining the peace, it helps us in avoiding our own direct involvement in wars abroad, which is much more costly, much more painful. And this is something that is in the interest of every American. I think we're gonna have to start doing some math, some research. How much did we spend on the first Gulf War, the aid to the region after the first Gulf War? How does it compare to what we spend in Ukraine? Frankly speaking, aid to Ukraine is still less than that. And how close and how important was that war? That's a comparison we need to make. I really believe that we're going to need to reframe, re-energize the argument about how critical winning this war is for the United States of America and for every American.
I'd note that in your context of this being a global war, when Russia acts to deny grain to the world, when Russia disrupts energy markets, and when Russia destroys civilians and engages in war crimes, that it is a Russian attack on the world as well. So it's global in that dimension also.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
Well, I don't want to keep you all day. I think this has been a great recap, and it's great to catch up with the discussion we had a few months ago to see the situation, which has some positives, but a lot of work still left to be done. So thank you, Natalie Jaresko, for joining us today.
Thank you so much for having me.